Welcome to Faith is Question-Worthy. Thank you for joining us today. Our guest is Allison from the Princeton University, currently one of, if not the leading historian when it comes to the historical Jesus. So since we already had Dale as a guest on our Easter episode, we'll skip the introduction this time. Today we'd like to talk with him about Christmas. Dale, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Quite happy to be here. And I guess Merry Christmas, huh?
Merry Christmas. So for the listeners, it is not really Christmas right now when we are doing this episode, but we're looking forward. And so I think we will have a good discussion today, even if it's not Christmas today, but we hope you can enjoy it. Dale, if we think about Christmas, I think many people believe that our modern Christmas traditions actually come from old pagan festivals. And what do you think about the idea that Christmas might not be as Christian as many assume?
Well, first of all, I would agree that parts of Christmas are not originally Christian, but I guess I'd begin by saying that that doesn't bother me in part. Now, this is a small point, but it's important. It doesn't bother me in part because Christians do lots of things that aren't biblical or in the Bible. So my church has an organ. It's not in the Bible. We have a choir director. We have Sunday school. If you're honest, it isn't even clear from the Bible or the New Testament that Christians have an imperative to get together and worship God on Sunday mornings. So there are lots of customs and habits and traditions that we have that aren't simply biblical. But you have to distinguish, I think, between the origin of something and then the use of something. So even if some of these traditions go back to pagan or pre-Christian times, that has nothing to do with what we are doing today. So when I'm celebrating Christmas morning with my family, or I'm at my church on Christmas Eve, everything is Christian. We are reading biblical texts. We are singing Christian songs. That is, there's nothing anymore, if there once was, pagan about these things. And the fact that maybe some of these things, like a Christmas tree, comes from outside the faith, I don't think should bother us. So I remember once years ago talking to somebody about "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." In German, Ein festive Burg, something like that, right? So Martin Luther's great hymn. And the guy told me that, well, Martin Luther wrote the words, but it was an old German pub song, something like this. Well, I gather he was wrong. I gather that the music experts don't think this, but let's say they were right. Let's say that this great hymn was actually originally a bar song sung by drunken German peasants, for example, and Martin Luther picked it up and put these words. Would that mean we shouldn't sing the song? I don't understand that sort of thinking, and I think it's the same sort of logic here. My own concern about Christmas isn't the origin of this custom or that custom. I'm actually worried about the commercialism and the message that we're always often given to children, which is, love is demonstrated by what you get or by giving objects, that sort of thing, turning little children into consumers. I have a grandson who is too spoiled. I'm already worried about him because he gets too many gifts, right? I'm half serious here. Anyway, that's my major concern with this, but it doesn't bother me that some of this is picked up by Christians from the surrounding world.
And what would you say is the pagan part about Christmas? Can we distinguish that between the original Christmas and the pagan part?
So what are you going to do for Christmas if you get rid of all our Christmas traditions? You don't have anything left to do. The New Testament doesn't tell you how to celebrate Christmas. It doesn't tell you what to do. If you just had a New Testament or you wanted to be purely biblical, you wouldn't do anything for any date. I guess we'll come to this in a second, but there's no date in the New Testament or the Bible or anywhere in history for the birth of Christ. So since we don't know the date, does that mean you'll never celebrate it? You got to pick some sort of date. And it seems to me that picking one that people are already celebrating is actually a fairly good strategy. I mean, rather than just leaving it alone and letting it go, why not Christianize it and turn it into something friendly to the faith? So that doesn't bother me at all. And by the way, this is always what happens when Christian missionaries go from this place or that place. There's always a reinterpretation of the tradition in terms of the culture. You know, when missionaries show up, they shouldn't demand that the people they're talking to dress like them and they do everything like them and so on. There is going to be a mixture between the new faith and the culture that's already there. And that, of course, has happened everywhere all the time. It's inevitable. I don't see how to get around it.
Yes, Dale, you just mentioned that there's no evidence in the Bible on the date Jesus was born, but some historians argue about that. And what do you say about that? What is your take on the theory that Jesus wasn't really born on the 25th December, or that the day was chosen to replace other festivals?
So how many days are there in a year? 365? So the odds that Jesus was born on December 25th, from my point of view, is 1 in 365. So this is as good and as bad as any of the other dates. The early Christians were not interested in this sort of fact because they don't record it anywhere. So, you know, you might try to wring something out of there were shepherds with their flock and so on, but you really can't do anything. So we don't know the date. I can't tell you whether it was the spring or whether it was the fall or whether it was the middle of summer. And I don't think anyone has really strong arguments for anything. So if Christians are going to celebrate this, if they're going to make it a holiday, if they're going to put it on the church calendar, they just have to pick a date. And again, I am sympathetic to them picking a date that people are already celebrating and substituting the new faith for the old things that were celebrated on that holiday. And again, come back to our time. This is an odd criticism. No matter where the Christmas tree came from, for me and my family and for you all and everybody watching, it doesn't hold those original pagan associations anymore. Those are just gone centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries ago. So I'm not going to worry about it.
But is there a special reason why we celebrate it on 25th December? Or
well, yeah, I think we're picking up a Roman holiday and substituting for it. And yeah, so celebration of the sun god. Again, I'm just repeating myself. Sorry about that. But I think it's a good strategy to take a holiday that's already there and to say, okay, let's turn it into the right kind of holiday, or let's displace the beliefs we don't like. That makes perfect sense. And those beliefs were, in fact, displaced. It's not as though people are sitting around in the modern world saying, oh, gosh, it's December 25th. We're really worshiping the sun god. That doesn't occur to anyone in church. It's way, way, way in the past. So it was successfully displaced. The worship of the sun god was successfully displaced. That's it. So we get on now with our Christian customs.
Now, some skeptics would claim that the Christmas story is more a myth or borrowing symbolic elements from other cultures rather than being a historical event. How do you view that as a historian?
Well, that's a huge question. So, first of all, if you're talking about the infancy narrative, we have to correct that and say we're talking about two infancy narratives. And then we have to look at the pieces. So there's the visit of the Magi. There's the Star of Bethlehem. There's the virgin birth. There are the shepherds in the field. So if you're thinking like an historian, you're going to ask about each particular item or event, right? So let me try to answer by going through some things. So what about the Star of Bethlehem? So I don't know how it is in Germany, but here in the States, we have planetariums. And during the holiday season, many of these planetariums have Christmas shows. I've been to them, and you can go in, and depending on the year and the film and what's popular, somebody will explain the Star of Bethlehem in secular, scientific, astronomical terms. And they will say, oh, it was a constellation, a conjunction of constellations or stars, or they will say it was a supernova, or sometimes they'll say it's a comet. Now, I'm an historian, and I'm immediately suspicious because these are modern categories. And I'm also suspicious because I know the exegetical history of the Star of Bethlehem. So it's only after Renaissance science and modern astronomy that people begin to think in the terms that you hear at the planetarium. So if you go back to the ancient world, so we have to do a little history here, and we have to get out of our own modern mindset. If you go back to the ancient world, almost all ancient peoples thought that the stars were animate beings. All right? You just have to acknowledge that. It's there. I don't have to argue it. It's just there. Secondly, there are lots of Jewish texts which also regard the stars as animate. And indeed, there are lots of texts which think of stars as angels. The equation is just straightforward in lots of texts. By the way, just from the Bible itself, you might remember, if you think hard enough, that the phrase the heavenly hosts sometimes means angels and sometimes it means stars. And it's because these are the same sorts of things. So when the ancients thought of stars, they didn't think of, gigantic balls of gas, separated by light years. That's not what they're doing. So they're thinking very differently. And with that in mind, then you go to the Gospel of Matthew, and it says clearly, unambiguously, that the star went in front of the Magi, and it came to stop over the place where the child was. So, if you read, let's say, Chrysostom, the great church father of the 4th century, he says, this isn't one of the lights in the sky. This is a light that comes down from the sky and goes in front of the Magi and stands in front of or above the residence. Now, that may seem wild and strange to you, but that's actually the dominant idea up through the Reformation, that this is do you guys know what Peter Pan is? I don't know. You know Peter Pan? If you know Peter Pan, you remember Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell is a light. And the dominant tradition is that this is a light that goes in front of the Magi, and it's very often understood to be an angel. I actually remember reading about an old guide in Israel who used to show the well where the star put itself out. So when the star was done with everything, it went down a well, and that's the last we saw of it. Anyway, that puts you in the mindset. Even Calvin, who's very learned and up on the science of his day, says you can't point out a particular place with these lights in the sky. The text says it took them to a house, to a place. So all I will say about that is that whether Matthew conceives of this as an angel, I don't think he's thinking of a conjunction or a supernova or a comet. He's thinking of something extraordinary. If I had to bet, I'd bet he thinks it's an angel. But the point is that when you have stories about angels in the Bible, you can't confirm them or disconfirm them scientifically or do anything actually with them historically. So I look at this text and I simply say, well, even if it happened, how could anyone show such a thing happened? There isn't any way to do this, right? So I think that the Star of Bethlehem is a sort of non-starter. That is, it's a non-starter for the apologist who wants to prove that the accounts are valid because we can show there was a constellation or a conjunction there that was really interesting, or a supernova or whatever. But I think the polemicists are also wrong to say, well, it's not clear there was some fantastic astrological event. But it's the same thing with the Magi. So who are the Magi? It's not clear what Matthew thinks. Are they from Arabia? Are they from Persia? Are they from Babylon? The word Magi, actually, it's the same root we get magician from. All right? It's the same root we get magician from. And I think the main thing here for Matthew is that they are pagans, they are non-Jews, and they are coming to recognize the King of the Jews. But again, how could you show that this happened or didn't happen? We've got the problem with these infancy narratives again and again and again, that we don't have multiple sources for things. Most of the time, we just have Matthew and we just have Luke, and we have them in highly supernatural narratives, right? And so modern people are just going to look at this and say, I just don't believe that. Or an historian's just going to look at this and say, how on earth do we judge these sorts of things? How do you decide that the story of an angel took place? Or how do you decide that the Magi actually went to Bethlehem at a certain time? The great Origen in the 3rd century observed the obvious, which is that most of the things that happened can't be confirmed or disconfirmed. It's just true. Most of the events in my life can't be confirmed or disconfirmed, even though they happened. And one of the things that we do too often is we like to think historians can give us the truth or they can answer everything. And then the apologists and the polemicists often agree. So you can either prove everything or you can disprove everything. And you have to remember there's this large space in there of claims that you can't prove or disprove. All you can do is talk about degrees of probability. And for many events, there's just nothing at all to go on. So I don't think you can do anything with the star. I don't think you can do anything with the Magi. By the way, sorry to interrupt all this history stuff, but there's this legend that I really like. So this is a legend in a book called The Cave of Treasures, and it's about the Magi. And it says that when Adam was kicked out of the Garden of Eden, he wanted to take some of his treasures with him. So he asked God, can I take some of my treasures? And God said, sure, you can take some gold and frankincense and myrrh. So Adam took gold and frankincense and myrrh, and when he died, they hid them in a cave. And then an angel guarded the entrance to the cave, just like the angel guards, or the cherubim guards, the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And then when the Magi were on their trip to Bethlehem, there was an angel that met them and said, hey, come over here. I got something for you. And so they go into the cave, they get their gold and frankincense and myrrh, and then they go on and give these to Jesus. So this is a legend. It's a fiction, but I like it very much because it's a narrative way of saying Jesus is the last Adam or Jesus is the second Adam. I just think it's really neat. What else? The slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem? Well, it is true. There is no other record of this. And that's all you have to say. You can't prove that it happened. Herod was a wicked king. Herod was really rotten in lots of despicable ways. And he did murder members of his family and other people. He could easily have done such a thing like this, but there is no record of this. Josephus says nothing about it. And so you just have to say, well, if you're a skeptic, you're just going to say probably didn't happen. Otherwise, you're going to say, well, it's in Matthew, and I don't have, this is frustrating, I don't have the means by which to prove that it happened. By the way, I should back up here and say, I think the infancy narratives are different than the rest of the Gospels. So that's what is going to make this dialogue or conversation today difficult. When you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have all sorts of overlapping themes. And you have Jesus saying the same thing in several Gospels or similar things across several Gospels. You have him uttering parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You have 4 different accounts of the last week in Jerusalem and so on. You have multiple things going on. You even have some things in Paul about Jesus. But when it comes to the infancy narratives, all you have are the infancy narratives, right? And they have very little overlap. So almost everything in Luke is just attested in Luke, and everything in Matthew is just attested in Matthew. And at least the way I operate as an historian, I'm usually looking for patterns across sources, right? I'm looking for repeating themes and motifs, and also for things that are just so well attested, like the crucifixion, that you simply can't doubt it no matter who you are, right? Or should it doubt it no matter who you are. The infancy narratives are just radically different, and you can't You can't approach them that way. They overlap in very few areas. So the things I just talked about, the star and the magi and the slaughter of the infants, they're only in Matthew. They are not in Luke. So that creates problems. It makes it difficult for us. The last thing I'll say here, boy, this is a long-winded answer to your question. The last thing I'll say is that I think it's fair to generalize that there are three approaches to the virgin birth, right? So the first approach would be to say that it happened and that it had a divine cause. So that's the traditional Orthodox Christian understanding, which is in the creeds. He was born of the Virgin Mary. The second explanation is a naturalistic explanation, and maybe you are familiar with this, but Origen in the 3rd century knows a story that is circulating that Mary had, before she married Joseph, had slept with a Roman soldier. And there's actually a name given to this fellow, Panthera. And most scholars don't think there's anything to this. My own guess is that this is probably a polemical legend. That is, some non-Christians have heard that Jesus was supposedly born of a virgin, and then they give the answer, well, no, I'll bet she slept with a soldier or something like that. And the rumor gets started. On that view, it would be like Matthew 7:28, where you have the story that the disciples came and stole the body. I don't think the disciples stole the body. You don't think the disciples stole the body. Somebody made that up to explain the fact that the tomb was empty. So I'm guessing that this story is the same sort of thing. So supernatural or natural explanation. Yeah, Joseph wasn't the father, but somebody else was. And then the mythological approach, which is very common among modern New Testament scholars, which is to say, well, we have stories of other heroes in the Greek and Roman worlds who are the product of a god mating with a woman or a god encountering a woman. You might be familiar with the story of Hercules or the story of Romulus. So they will say, well, it's something like that. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the great Roman Catholic scholar Raymond Brown, English scholar. Anyway, he wrote what is the standard book in our language called The Birth of the Messiah. It's a commentary on the infancy narratives. And it's very interesting because Brown was a Catholic, and yet he was also a modern critical historian. And in that book, he says, well, I don't think I can argue as an historian that Jesus was born of a virgin, but I do believe this on theological grounds. And I think that's what the Christian is going to have to say. The Christian is not going to be able to say, I can prove that Jesus was born of a virgin because here's all the evidence. There's not a lot of evidence, right? So if you believe it, it's going to be for theological reasons, not for historical reasons. This only occurs in Matthew and Luke, right? And it's not in Mark, it's not in John, it's not in Paul. Some people think they can find a hint of it maybe in Paul or a hint in Mark, but those are at best hints. So you don't have a lot to go on. It's also true that this is just not a major belief in the earliest Christian texts. It becomes really important with the creeds, with the Apostles' Creed and with the Nicene Creed, but it's just only there in Luke, actually in passing in Luke, and then it's part of the substance of the first chapter of Matthew, but that's really it. So I don't know how you could build a robust historical case from that. Again, if you're a skeptic, you're just going to either cite the parallels or you'll refer to this old story that I think is a legend about Panthera and a Roman soldier. But if your theology requires this or is friendly to it, then you can be like Raymond Brown. See how frustrating this is? You see how I don't have the answers today? This is much harder than the empty tomb or the appearances of Jesus or the crucifixion or the parables. there's just, at least from the historian's point of view, so little to go on. Although, I don't know, maybe I should, I'll just wait for the next question, okay? I don't want to talk too much.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because my question now would be, because we talked last time about Easter, and if I get you right, you made a strong case for the believer, and you said you can also make a strong case for the skeptical, but there's more historical evidence where you can build it up on Easter. So Christmas is a whole different thing, right? You cannot make these strong cases for one side or the other.
I don't think you can make strong cases because the sources are so thin and so scant. I think you have a lot to work with the resurrection stories, and that you can make really good arguments for this or for that. It's really important to me that certain things happened as a Christian. So I need Jesus to have not been defeated by death. All right? That's important. And I think that is entwined with certain historical things. I also think it's important that Jesus suffered and died. I think it's important that he was a certain sort of person. So there are these things that are really important to me historically. And I focus on them rather than the infancy narratives because, in part, I'm an historian, right? I'm an historian. And I think I can say a lot about the things I just talked about and other things. And as an historian, there's just not much to say here about the infancy narratives, which is why in my own, I guess you would say my private theology or my personal piety, I do tend not to dismiss all history or all possible history, but I do tend to read Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 first of all, before I go doing the historical hunting. I read them like I do Genesis or the parables of Jesus. So, Christians aren't upset when you say that when Jesus tells the parable of the sower, we shouldn't ask historical questions. A sower went out to sow. Well, where was he? And what was his name? And what was the date? And when did this happen? We look at that and we say, okay, that's a story, but we say it's a profound story and we can meditate on it. We can preach from it, even though it didn't happen. Now, I'm a modern Christian. I was raised as a liberal Protestant, and I don't worry about Genesis 1, 2, and 3 as history, but I do think about them as theology, as parables. And in my churches, where people believe in evolution and think that the world is several billion years old, we still read and preach from the book of Genesis, and we regard ourselves as being faithful, and we think we've been forced into this, right? Because of modern knowledge, modern geology, and we think there's got to be something to evolutionary theory and so on. Now, that's okay for a lot of people with Genesis, right? But then when you come to the Gospels, it's more problematic. And it is for me. I don't want to read the Passion narratives as mythology or parable or story. I want there to be a real history here, right? But I'm less concerned about the infancy stories, in part because the New Testament itself doesn't put these front and center. That is, the speeches in Acts don't refer to anything in these chapters. Paul doesn't refer to anything. John doesn't refer to anything. Mark doesn't refer to anything. So I think the theological weight was elsewhere. And the theological weight, among other things, is on the crucifixion, on the death, and the resurrection. So I have to think about those things very seriously as an historian and do as much work as I can. But I am, I suppose, less existentially invested in the infancy narratives. Although I love them as texts, I think that they're really remarkable. And Luke's texts are especially beautiful, but they frustrate me as an historian because I can't do much with them.
I think what's crucial to me is that if Jesus is not born of a virgin, how can he be the Son of God? Is there a possibility? If he's just born of a mother and a father the normal way, like any other man?
Okay, so what you are doing there is the sort of thing I think I was saying Raymond Brown did. So if you through your theological reasoning, think that this story makes sense and that your understanding, let's say, of Son of God or incarnation would make less sense without it, then you're going to be like Karl Barth and you're going to say, yeah, I believe this, all right, even though I know the historians aren't going to be, backing me up on this, right? They're going to be somewhere else. So given who I am, I do engage in theological reasoning and philosophical reasoning. I think history is very limited. And so there is more to theology than history. So you're illustrating, I think, Raymond Brown's idea, although he was also a Catholic. And so for him, this is one of the things taught by Mother Church, right? It's doctrine. So he felt bound to it. But you have your own analogy to that, your own belief or belief system or doctrinal system. And if the virgin birth fits into that, then it fits into that.
That's true. That was not a question to you as a historian, because you said before that some things are crucial to you, that Jesus was not defeated by death. So I think there is no Easter without Christmas, right?
Oh, okay. So it depends on what you mean by Christmas, but certainly Jesus was born into the world. And then you have the question of what do you mean by incarnation and how do you understand it? Okay, so for me, the incarnation is a really crucial, fundamental, profound idea that I've been trying to understand all my life. And I can't exactly get my head around it. I've read a lot of literature. I've read the church fathers. I'm reading a book now by a modern theologian trying to unravel it. So for me, the incarnation is a mystery. And of course, it would be consistent with a virgin birth. But I don't think I need one in order to have an incarnation. But I'm confronted by something that I can't get my head around, okay? Let me put it this way. I think it's dangerous for Christians to call things mysteries because that can be an excuse for not thinking. But in my case, I've been thinking about this really hard for decades. And so maybe I've earned the right to say this really is a mystery. I can't figure it out. It's like the problem of evil. I still have lots and lots of questions.
Okay, Dale. So you already mentioned that the Gospels give different accounts of Jesus' birth, and they don't quite match up on the first side. But what do you think? Do these differences affect the credibility of the biblical Christmas story, or aren't they? What do you think?
I would put it this way. I would say that these differences frustrate the historian for reasons that I have indicated, or at least they frustrate me as an historian. One of the things you might try to do, this would be a way around this. It's not how I operate, but you might want to say something like, well, everywhere that I can confirm Luke, I think Luke is a reliable historical author. And therefore, I'm going to trust him in the areas when I can't confirm this or that. You can do that, but that's just not how I think as an historian, right? And when I think of Luke, I think of, well, I want to sort of take the text apart and analyze it piece by piece, and I don't really know how to do something like that. So I suppose if you're a skeptic, that makes some sense. But so you have shepherds in Luke and you don't have shepherds in Matthew. What does that tell you? It tells you that Luke has a tradition about shepherds and Matthew doesn't. What does that tell you? Does that prove anything? It proves they have different traditions. Look, let me tell you how frustrating this is. So you may know that Luke's first 4 verses are written in pretty good Greek, pretty highfalutin Greek. And then his infancy narrative is written in very Semitic Greek. And then when you get to chapter 2, it goes back to more normal Koine Greek. So the infancy narrative in Luke 1 and 2 doesn't have the same stylistic characteristics as the rest of the book, although there are thematic parallels at points. So some people have looked at Luke and said, you know what? He must be working with Semitic sources or originally Semitic sources. And I'm actually if I had to bet, I don't know how much confidence I have, but if I had to bet, I think that might be right. So Luke then may be using sources for the infancy narrative that we're talking about, and maybe they were Semitic, written in Hebrew or Aramaic. But then what do I do after that? I don't know where they come from. That is, even if I can say they're pre-Luke, where do they come from? So some scholars have thought that the stuff about Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, might come from a Baptist source. Well, maybe it does, but I don't know. Another great Roman Catholic scholar, a German scholar named Heinz Schurmann, thought that Luke's material goes back to female tradents or women believers, and that these are women's tradition that come from somewhere. Well, I don't know. Maybe so. I don't know what more to say to that. That is, I have Luke, and then I think I probably have sources, but I don't know what to do with these sources because, again, there are no overlaps with Josephus. There are no overlaps with Paul or Mark or anybody. They're just there. I also think that if you're being honest, you can ask the question, well, how did anybody record what Mary said spontaneously once? Or how did somebody record what Zechariah exactly said spontaneously? Those have to be, at the best, they have to be write-ups of traditions, I think. But I don't know who's writing them up. I don't know where they come from. The other thing I should add here, I think this is pretty well known, but Matthew's text is highly symbolic. If you think about it, it's clear there's a Moses typology going on because the Savior of Israel is born. There's a wicked king on the throne. This king decides to kill Jewish infants. Then the Savior is miraculously delivered. He actually goes down to Egypt at one point. You skip his childhood. He goes down into the waters. When he comes up, he goes into the desert. He's tempted in the desert. He's tempted to idolatry. He's tempted by hunger. Then he goes up on a mountain and gives his commandments. It looks like Matthew is taking his traditions and putting them together in a certain way that says this is a new Moses. This is somehow a replay of the Exodus. And that is going to make you, once the typology is that strong, you're going to inevitably ask historical questions. Now, Matthew's working with traditions. He didn't make up the baptism. He didn't make up the temptation. He didn't make up the Sermon on the Mount, but he is reworking them and putting them in a certain order and adding things here and there so that you get the point. This is a replay. So this goes back to my own inclination earlier. So I can talk all day about Jesus as Moses in Matthew, and it's really interesting theologically. But if you want to start asking me about the historical details, then I'm just back with where I am with Luke. That is, I just have a story, and that's it. I have a story and then another story and another story. And I don't know their histories. I don't know where they come from. So I'm just frustrated. But I'm not frustrated with doing Matthew's theology or looking at the main themes of the infancy narrative and so on. So I don't know whether you or your audience will be sympathetic at all, but I have some sympathy for people who say, let's try to find the meaning of the story and let's worry less about what we can establish or show historically.
Is there a part where you would say there we can have great certainty about Jesus' birth and infancy?
Well, look. Well, so yeah, there are some really easy things, but everybody would say them, or at least everybody who knows anything. Yes, Luke and Matthew agree that Jesus' parents were named Mary and Joseph. Although, again, it's so weird because all the focus is on Joseph in Matthew and all the focus is on Mary in Luke, right? They agree on that. They agree on Bethlehem and Nazareth. And more importantly, they agree that this took place at the end of the reign of Herod the Great. So there are these points of agreement. But what's so odd is then they go their own way despite, these similarities. So they're not completely dissimilar. Maybe I should emphasize that. I don't want to leave that point. And if you want to argue, Colin, theologically the way you did, you could say, well, one of the things they have in common is the virgin birth, right?
Okay, Dale. So you're a professor at Princeton, and Princeton is one of the top universities in the world. And so if I were a skeptic, I would question, how can someone like you, who works at this kind of university, believe that God became human in form of Jesus Christ? How can you believe that?
Well, I guess I would say, so my faith depends on multiple factors. It depends on my interpretation of nature. It depends on my own religious experiences. It depends upon the religious experience of others. It depends on theological ideas that help me to navigate the world. So I can't give you a sort of this one reason is why I am the way I am, or this is why I think the way I am. Maybe I'm a bit of a pragmatist. Maybe I could say that there are certain Christian ideas that are profound, that help me to make sense of the world. I could also say that there are certain Christian people with which I think I'm always going back to them, and I think that they are profound. So for me, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Isaac of Nineveh, and Pascal, for example, are incredibly profound people. They were all Christians, and they have helped me to understand the world. They've helped me to understand life. They've added meaning to who I am. So that's a very personal sort of existential thing. Now, that's the truth, I suppose, of why I am a Christian. But there's another way of answering that, which is give me the reasons. Well, if you want to do that, then that's another podcast. But it would have to do with teleological thinking and philosophical considerations and discussion of world religions and all sorts of things that come into this. But I think that a religious worldview is the only thing ultimately that makes sense of the world. And I am a Christian for multiple personal reasons, but also for some, I guess, academic or intellectual reasons. But this isn't the podcast about me. I guess what's important to say is that I am not answering your question by saying, well, I believe it all in faith, because I think that's a sort of, or can be an epistemological cop-out. I continue to think and worry and read and ponder and reflect about all the intellectual questions that are out there. So I don't think I am taking refuge in just what I want to believe. I'm trying to think through issues. And maybe that comes across in today's broadcast. You see how difficult and confusing I find this, but I'm trying to be honest. It would be lovely if I could come to you and say, you know what, Matthew 1 through 2 is just pure solid rock history, and here are the 10 reasons for thinking this, and we don't have any problems, gang, right? But that's not how I found it to be. I found this to be very difficult, and just trying to be candid as I can be.
Thank you so much for that, Dale. And what you found frustrating, and I believe that is frustrating as a historian. I think it was really fascinating for us to have this background. And maybe the last question, are you a fan of celebrating Christmas?
Oh, yes, I love Christmas. In fact, we have 3 children, and they have families, and everybody comes to our house in Princeton for Christmas, and it's the happiest time of the year. I love Christmas trees. I love decoration. I love the food. I love giving gifts. I like the Christmas Eve service, right? I don't go on Sunday morning. I go to the Christmas Eve service. Sunday morning, we're at the Christmas tree, right? I like eggnog. I like all those old pagan traditions, right? But it's also Christmas, because I love the Christmas hymns, right? I love the Christmas hymns. Some of them make me cry, and I love the reading of the stories from the infancy narratives, especially Luke at Christmas time. So Yeah, I'm a big fan. So yeah, I'm not on board with the people who think this is all pagan. That makes no sense to me at all. My only worry is consumerism, right? That's my big worry. Or that, of course, Christmas has become, for people who don't have faith, it's just become a secular holiday, right? So that's a bit strange. But I still think gift giving is the basic idea of giving to other people is a good idea. So that's okay.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thanks for your time. So let's say Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Oh, the pleasure was all ours. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for your time. We are now heading into our Christmas break, so this will have been our last episode for this year. We wish you all a happy new year in advance and look forward to catching up with you again at the beginning of January. Goodbye.